Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Judge Penny Wolfgang in for Phil Arno. Election day is coming upon us fast, and the race for president is one of the most contentious in American history. Here with the latest on that, the voting process, and a look at some local contests, is our very own political analyst, Vic Martucci, from Mazziello, Martucci, Calabrese, and Associates, and we're so glad to have him back with us.
Thanks for having me, Judge.
Thank you so much for coming. So, who do you think, a big question, of course, who won the debate on Thursday night?
Well, that's not a simple answer, so let me answer it this way. Both candidates, in my opinion, had an objective going into last night. I think the president's objective was he needs to expand his 2016 voter coalition that resulted in his election. For Vice President Biden, I think his objective was to motivate parts of his base to come out that didn't come out for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and that's namely minority voters and young voters. And so when you look at it through that prism, I think that that the president did some things that may help him expand his base a little bit. I thought he was particularly effective in reaching out to minorities when he pointed out the vice president's vulnerability on the 1994 crime bill that he sponsored, and that resulted in the incarceration of over 30,000 young black men across the country. Joe Biden has never been particularly strong with minority voters. He needs minority voters to come out in large numbers to overcome the base that the president has. And so I think that was a specific objective of the president last night. Vice President Biden, on the other hand, I thought was very empathetic when he addressed minority voters, particularly blacks, about what he called the talk, where black parents have a conversation with their children about if you're pulled over by a police officer, make sure that your two hands on the steering wheel, make sure it's yes sir and no sir, because there's a chance that you could be shot. And you know, one of the vice president's great strengths is empathy, and I thought he did a very good job of that. So I'm not trying to dodge the question. I'd say it was probably a draw. I thought both candidates had their moments, and both candidates made mistakes and left opportunities on the table.
You know, one of the questions that when we first thought of talking to you about this today was, what about the shouting, and how bad is the shouting matches and so forth? Well, they didn't do the shouting matches.
Right.
And I think that made a big difference, too.
No question. I think for the first time in the campaign, voters were able to discern a very clear contrast between the two candidates. The president is clearly a proponent of more limited government, more personal responsibility. The vice president is more a proponent of bigger government solving problems for people. And so I thought the lines were drawn fairly clearly as to what direction each wants to take the country in the next 4 years.
Now, what about this, what we call bombshell accusations that came out right before about Joe Biden's son Hunter and all of that? How do you think that will it have any impact on the race?
Well, I think the only way that it will have an impact is if somebody of great credibility gives some credence to the issue. 4 years ago, as Hillary Clinton painfully remembers, what began to trigger the narrowing of the polls was the James Comey letter to Congress about the emails. That came from the FBI director. One of the perceptions of the president is that he's dishonest. Whether that's fair or not, a great majority of people in this country believe he's dishonest. So it's not enough for the president to make the accusation. I think it has to come from a credible source. If it does, it could change the entire dynamic of the race, because my personal opinion is that Biden's best chance to win is that he offers the public a return to normalcy, and that it's a return to ethics. And if that perception of Vice President Biden's ethical persona is shattered, that could flip the entire race on its ear. But I think it has to come from a really credible source.
And I don't know if you know the answer, but other than that, what effect this has have on the voters? Because he made a comment, I guess Biden said, this is not about our children. Race is not about our sons or our daughters. It's about us. And, you know, I thought that was kind of effective.
Right.
To the people.
That's right.
Voters.
And you know, the issue is not a direct link to the vice president, unless you can demonstrate that the vice president personally influenced policy that benefited his son. And you know, what's in the public domain right now doesn't make that direct link clear. And so, absolutely. In fact, I think people recoil when you attack a candidate's children.
Yes, I can speak. I can definitely speak to that. You know, so the other negative issues are regarding Dr. Fauci. I mean, how do you think that plays with the people, in the sense that there's a whole cadre of people who trust Dr. Fauci because of his, who need to believe in him, and on the other hand, with the president attacking him, or the idea that he might be attacking him, which he denied actually, I don't know how it affects the voters.
Yeah, well, it just reinforces the perception, which is probably the president's greatest vulnerability in this campaign, is his performance on handling the COVID pandemic. And attacking Dr. Fauci, who has enormous respect and credibility among the American public, and all the polls show that, again, is a mistake. If the president is trying to expand his coalition, what the president is doing when he does that is he's speaking to his base. And he's trying to motivate his base to make sure that they come out and vote. Unfortunately for him, in my opinion, is that his base is not going to be enough this time. He needs to expand that base, and so he's walking a very fine line, in my opinion, between throwing red meat to the base and taking positions on policies that enable him to expand that coalition.
So many people want to believe in doctors and want to believe in their credibility, and especially Dr. Fauci. So, I mean, he has like I don't know, he's a folk hero to many people. So I think that's an issue. So now the big question, which you and I are always talking about, and with John and everybody before, is polls. So what are the polls saying, and can we believe them, and how should we look at them?
Yeah, so first I'd point out that polling in general is a very accurate barometer of where the race is today and where it's trending. So what I mean by that is you don't look at the numbers today, because it's only a snapshot in time. The way you look at polls are, what's the trend? Are the trends moving in one direction towards one candidate or another? Because polling is not an exact science. That's why they tell you there's a margin of error of plus or minus 3% or plus or minus 4%. And then there's another indicator that most people have never heard of, and that's the confidence interval. The confidence interval tells you how reliable the sample is. And most polls have a confidence interval of 97 to 98%. Well, what that means is there's a 2 to 3% chance that the sample is garbage and the whole poll is invalid. So polling's not an exact science. But I will tell you, one of my pet peeves is that this constant notion that the polls were wrong 4 years ago. The polls were dead on 4 years ago. The polls had Hillary Clinton up by about 3 percentage points going into Election Day in the national vote. She won by 2.6 percentage points, well within the margin of error. The polls in the battleground states were all narrowing as we got closer to Election Day, and they were moving towards Donald Trump. And for whatever reason, experts were ignoring that. And so if you looked at what was happening out there, you really shouldn't have been surprised at the outcome of the election. So where are we today? Joe Biden is ahead by about 7 percentage points in the national polls, and that's the metric I always look at is there's a website called Real Clear Politics, and what they do is they report all of the various polls that are out there, and they do an average. And I think that's smart because polls have different methodologies, they have different sample sizes, and so if you want to look at trends, it's good to look at the averages. The average lead for Joe Biden is about 7 percentage points nationwide. His lead in the battleground states, the key 10 to 12 battleground states, is less. It's about 4.8 percentage points. It's a little higher than where they were 4 years ago. The polls were beginning to narrow for Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton this time 4 years ago. But I'll tell you this, in my opinion, there's 6 states that Donald Trump won in 2016, that Barack Obama won in 2012, and it's why he won the election in 2016. Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida, and Iowa. Those are the 6 states. Joe Biden currently leads in 5 of those 6 states, but in 3 of them, only 3 of them, beyond the margin of error. So in other words, his lead is anywhere from 6 to 8 points. That's in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Those are the states to watch, in my opinion. If the polls begin to narrow in those 3 states, and the president can hold the other states that he won 4 years ago, we could all be surprised again on Election Day, and I think the next 5 to 6 days are gonna determine what's gonna happen.
Oh, that's scary. You know, speaking of Pennsylvania, did you hear them talking about when they were talking about the environment and the whole conversation that they said might affect Pennsylvania greatly because of the fracking issue and so forth?
Right. Right.
During the debate? Yeah,
and that was one of the points in the debate that I thought the president scored some major points, was in forcing the vice president to admit that he wants to move away from oil. And where that's significant is in Pennsylvania, it's in Ohio, Michigan because of the auto industry, and in Texas. And people will say, well, Texas, why Texas? Because the president should win big in Texas. Texas is changing. It's a different state than it was 4 years ago. It's still a red state, but it's moving towards purple, and the president's lead in Texas is only 7 points. He won Texas by 13 points 4 years ago. So, in my opinion, that was a gift from the vice president to the president last night.
So when we come back, we'll discuss some local races and voting updates and some other issues, so please stay with us.